Hello again, everyone. I hope you're doing well. Another video for you this week. This time I want to talk about Orientalism by Edward Said. The essay I gave you to read for homework. It's posted under last week on Moodle. But I did give a kind of classwork assignment for you to do this week with some questions about it. And I want to talk about it not only because I gave you an assignment about it, but also because I think that this essay is extremely important to M. Butterfly. I think there's interviews where David Henry Hwang talks about this essay. This is, an extremely influential essay generally, but like the author of M. Butterfly was very aware of this essay, and I think a lot of the stuff he does in the play was kind of with the theories of Edward Said in mind. So I think that this could be used as a source for basically any essay that you're writing about M. Butterfly. In fact, I almost think you need to use it as a source in a way. Not that I'm requiring it, I'm not. But I think it would be a really good move, and that would, give you some of the research. I also posted another essay, which maybe I'll do a quick video about it for next Monday. But I gave you an essay to read, another one that's about M. Butterfly. And that would also, I think, be a great essay to use for your own writing, and that's why I asked you to read it. But yeah, I want to explain a little bit what's going on with this essay, Orientalism, and how it helps us think about the play. All right, so I'm going to get into some specific quotes, but I think like the kind of big contribution that this essay makes and how it specifically connects to M. Butterfly. I think it has a lot to do with kind of like categories of identity. Things that we've been talking about a lot, like men, women, East and West, or, in terms of like racial terms of like Europe versus the Orient, as they call it, right? In your own writing, I would probably avoid terms like the Orient or Oriental. I would avoid those terms generally. I think they're used in some of the stuff that we're reading, but I think that's because this stuff's old. I don't think that's really something people say anymore. So I probably, would go with like Asian or whatever. Or if you're talking about song, obviously you could say Chinese, since that's where song's from. Um, but yeah, so Said was interested in kind of these categories of identity and kind of looking at like the material conditions that they came from. So he's very interested in the stuff about like East and West, and what he does in his, Orientalism is a full-length book, and what he does, I think what we read was basically some of the introduction, and what he does throughout the book is go through all these different examples of different kind of historical pieces of writing from like he looks at novels, he looks at like government documents, scientific essays, nonfiction writing, like historical essays, like everything basically. And he basically tries to trace like the creation through different writings and stuff done for different reasons. He basically tries to trace the creation of these categories of East and West. So, okay, a term that I want to introduce. I think I've used this before. I don't know if I ever really explained it though. So a lot of these kind of, I'm calling them like identity categories, right? Something that you'll notice about these is that usually there's two. There tends to always be two, right? Which doesn't make a lot of sense because I think we know from our own experience that there's always more than just these two things, right? Like and he says in here, like when we're talking about East and West, like okay, where are the borders on that? Like where on the map is it? Oh, okay, this is the East. Okay, this is the West. It's nowhere. And even if it was, that would have been made up anyway, right? Because these maps are made up. Um, so I think that's his first point. And he says it here right at the beginning of the portion that I gave us to read. He said on page 1866 by the page numbers on there. He says the Orient was almost a European invention. So that's kind of what he finds from looking at all this stuff is that the idea of the East as something coherent, as something different from Europe, as something with like definite characteristics that you could pin to it, that was basically made up by Europeans, but not not in such like a conspiratorial way though. Like I don't think it was like the Queen of England and the leaders of these other countries coming together and be like, we'll hatch this nefarious plot to make the East look bad. It more happened from yeah, the experiences of like traders, like people who would go to do trade in the East. There was a big genre at the time that was known as travel writing, where basically, since in the 1800s and stuff, you couldn't, not a lot of people traveled like they do now. Um, you could, someone who did travel, they would go, they'd take a trip to Egypt or whatever, and they would write a book about it. And the way that most people in Europe experienced these faraway places was through writing, because there weren't movies. You had operas like Madame Butterfly, right? Madame Butterfly would definitely, I think, be considered a Orientalist text, right, in Said's term, because it's written by a European, right? It was written by Giacomo Puccini, it's an Italian guy, and it tries to create an image of the East, right, as if it is like a fact of nature, right? Okay, but I want to say more about this idea of binaries. So a binary is just what like having two opposing things, right? East, west, man, woman. And I think that like one of the reasons that we do this with identity, um, and we know like it doesn't really sync up with reality, right? Like I think maybe you've heard the term binary most nowadays in terms of people being non-binary, right? And what usually they're talking about gender with that, and basically non-binary is not fitting into man or woman, being somewhere in between or something like that. Or like fluid, right? I think gender fluid is used in this way to like specify I'm not in either of these boxes. I'm fluid or non that, right? Um, so it's like I think one of the reasons that we have these kind of binaries about like identity and stuff is because I think that a large part of how we make sense of the world as a whole is through binary thinking. Like things like light dark, right? A binary, light and dark. It's either light or it's dark. Well, what about at dusk? What about at sunset? I don't know. Good and bad are another binary, right? And it's like, well, what if you're doing a bad thing but for the right reason, or what if you're doing a good thing but for a bad reason? Where's that fit on good and bad? I think the reason that we have kind of these like this or that, the reason that we have these binary ways of thinking about stuff, I think, is just because of how our brains work. It's just a way for humans to kind of impose an order on reality because and we have a kind of we have a desire and almost a need to do this as humans because if we don't impose an order on it, then it's just chaos, and I don't think we deal with that well. uh, People always say that humans are kind of wired to recognize patterns, right? That our brains, just the way that they are biologically put together, that we recognize patterns in ways like other creatures don't. And I think that this is part of that. I think just because of the way our brains are, we want to like sort things and we want to categorize things so that we can understand them, so it can make sense to us. But I think the problem with this is that the way, like the kind of sense that our brains try to make out of stuff, the stuff doesn't always adhere to that. So I think this is why we end up with these binaries. Some other binaries, like black white, I think is a binary, like in terms of like racial terms and otherwise, just in terms of colors. Even though, yeah, what about gray? In terms of colors, or like, what about people who are of both races or something like that? Where do they fit into a black-white binary? Heaven and hell, I think that's an old binary. So like a lot of this stuff, I think, is kind of ingrained to us from like ancient shit, where people were just like, okay, well, there's this and there's this, there's men and there's women, there's east and there's west, there's black and there's white, there's good and there's bad. So I think that this is a totally flawed way of thinking about the world, and I think that uh, our culture is kind of starting to come to terms with this, at least in terms of the identity ones, because the ones about identity are particularly harmful, right? Like think about like good and bad, like yeah, there's some things that are in between, but that doesn't like directly lead to anyone's whatever oppression or colonization or anything like that. The way that these other things can. Okay, but here's another part of this. Okay, so there's these binaries, right? Something that I think M Butterfly really tries to show us is the way that these binaries get linked together. Um, Let me take a step back actually. Another thing about these binaries, and you'll notice with all the ones that I mentioned, that there's always one term that is supposed to be like the good one, and one term that's supposed to be the bad one, at least in like compared to each other, right? Light, dark. We know that light is supposed to be the good one. Heaven, hell. Obviously, heaven's the good one. And then good, bad. Obviously, good is the good one. You know, because that's like I think part of the reason that we want to separate into this either or situation is then because we can go, oh well, this one's good and this one's bad, right? And that's whatever when you're looking at those. But what about when it's white and black? What about when it's male, female? What about when it's west, east? So there's a hierarchy with these binaries. One of the terms is always privileged. One of the terms is always like supposed to be better. Okay, and then beyond that, they're also linked together. And I think one of the things that M Butterfly really tries to show us is the way that the binaries of man and woman are linked to the binary of west and east, right? And there's that a line by Song where Song I was talking about this in the other video where Song talks about like you know the West it's big guns, big industry, aggressive, whatever. The East it's weak but artistic, you know. So like there's all these things that are opposites, like whereas and all the ones that work for the West are also the ones that work for men, right? I think like the emotion like so like men and by extension the West are thought to be like logical, right? Scientific reasoning, whereas women and the East are thought to be emotional, right? Artistic or emotional, or you know, the East. Well, they have like all like religion and stuff, right? But like the West, it's all about Isaac Newton and science and how yeah. So these binaries they're very connected to stereotypes. That's why I said that. But that these binaries, that one term is always privileged in it, and that there's then a linkage between the one for East and West, and that one goes to another one that's about you know logic versus emotion, and that goes to another one about being aggressive versus being passive. You know, so yeah, I think that's a lot of things that are happening here. Okay, let me get back to some quotes here. Um, so yes, I gave you the one that says the Orient was a European invention. Another one he says here. He says the Orient has helped to define Europe or the West as its contrasting image, idea, personality, and experience. So I thought this was interesting, the contrasting image for Europe, because this is the binary construction, right? So I think basically what Said tries to say is that like when Europeans like started going to the East a lot, you know, when they like discovered it, you know, that basically they saw it as a good thing to set up as an opposite to themselves, you know, and not like consciously, not conspiratorially, but it just kind of like what happened, uh, where they said, oh well, you know, these people in the East, like they're so religious and artistic. Well, you know, we're smart and scientific, we're logical, right? So it became a way, a thing, like basically it helped Europe to understand what it was supposed to be, that like it locked in the stereotypes about Europe having this like other to set yourself off against, right? Because it's like, well, what are we as Europe? Like, what is Europe collectively? What binds us together? Well, we're not that, right? And then, well, what does not that mean? It's like, well, they're religious, we're scientific, and whatever. They're weak, so we're strong, whatever. Um, so yeah, the idea of it being the contrasting image, and it's not like, okay, we're Europe, we have all these qualities. Oh, and now we discover Asia, and they just have all the opposite qualities. It turns out, no, it's not like that. I think Said is kind of thinking more that Europeans didn't really have any idea of like what Europe was supposed to be as a collective unit, and that then they found these other people and saw like what they were like, or at least the things that they didn't like about them, and said, oh, well, we're the opposite of that, you know. So it's like the discovery of the other helps to define the self, which in this case was like the West and the East. Like the West discovering the East helped it to define the West. If that makes any sense. Um, okay, then we get some definitions of Orientalism. He talks about how it came up like through the academy. He says anyone who teaches, writes, or about or researches the Orient is an Orientalist, and what they do is Orientalism. So basically, I think he kind of implicates like professors and academics as being part of this process, right? Because, like I said, he doesn't just look at novels or something. He also looks at like science essays and books that are written during this time, and stuff about economics and biology and all these things. So basically, there was these Western scholars basically creating a whole like area of study that was studying the East. That they basically turned the East into something that could be objectively like studied, as if it was totally coherent, as if like the East really meant something. Yeah, so he goes on to say on 1867, uh, yeah, that basically the thing about Orientalism is he lists all these different kinds of writers, right? Novelists, philosophers, political theorists, economists, imperial administrators, who have accepted the basic distinction between East and West as the starting point for elaborate theories, epics, novels, social descriptions, and political accounts. So he's saying that like all these different fields, they like accept it as fact that the East and West are totally distinct, that they are like naturally existing categories, right? That's the thing, and I think this helps us understand what's going on with Gallimard, right? Is the mistake is to think that these categories are naturally existing, and then we can just kind of study them and look at them and like, oh wow, okay, the East, yeah, they do things this way, and they prefer this kind of economy, and their leaders, their governments are this way and stuff like that. And basically, he's saying that like just like the idea that there would be something coherent called the East that we could study to Said is a consequence of Orientalism. Let me see. I think I have a couple more quotes I want to look at here. All right, on page 1868. Okay. I think this is a quote that helps us think about Gallimard. So on 1868, at the bottom of the first paragraph there, he says European culture gained in strength and identity by setting itself off against the Orient as a sort of surrogate or even underground self. European culture gained in strength and identity by setting itself off against the Orient. So this is what I was saying about like the idea that like the stereotypes about Europe or like what it meant to be European, that was strengthened by like setting it off. Yeah, by taking the Orient as the total opposite, by taking the East as the total opposite. He says that the West gained in strength and identity, and this reminds me of the specific part when after the first time that Gallimard is at Song's apartment, and then when he goes back to work and he's like doing really well and he gets promoted and stuff, and his boss is like, "You're this new aggressive thing" or whatever. I think in that, and Gallimard says that for the first time ever, he's experiencing the absolute power of man, right? I think like that scene is what this sentence is. It's Gallimard gaining in strength and identity by setting himself off against Song, right? That basically, because you found something to occupy the lower part of the binary, you can now occupy the higher part of the binary, right? So basically, what happens with Gallimard and Song there is essentially like a microcosm of what happened with the West and the East on a larger scale, at least according to Said here, right? All right, one more quote, or maybe two actually. Okay, 1869, right under this section two here. He says the Orient is not an inert fact of nature. It is not merely there, just as the Occident itself is not there either. So this is going back to the idea that these categories are not just there. It's not just that we looked at the world and we went, oh wow, there just happen to be these categories, right? No, that's not how he sees it. He sees it as being imposed from within the mind of humans. I think that's right if we think about how these binaries work, like how all the other ones work, how yeah, like I was saying, I think they're more a function of our brains than of how reality actually is. Okay, last quote here. Okay, so here's the definition of Orientalism that he gives on page 1870. He gives a bunch of different definitions of Orientalism, right? And that's kind of why I wanted to ask that as one of the questions for you, to kind of have you, find one that like makes sense to you, because he gives probably 3 or 4 different definitions. So the one he gives here is Orientalism is an accepted grid for filtering through the Orient into Western consciousness. An accepted grid for filtering through the Orient into Western consciousness. So basically, he's saying that it's something that filters it through, right? So it's like a lens. So basically, that Orientalism is the lens through which the West looks at the East, right? It's uh, all the stereotypes, right? That the East is supposed to be weak and passive and emotional and religious and submissive and all these things. That basically the category that's associated with all these stereotypes that whenever Westerners, in terms of like academics or anything else, or military people, when they like we saw with Gallimard, when they look at the East, it's through the lens of this binary. It's through the lens of these stereotypes and stuff. And maybe the larger point too, and Said does get to this, is how this like is put to ideological uses in terms of like supporting empire and war and stuff. I think I won't say too much because I talked about this I think in my last video, but like that essentially like these were all kind of justifying narratives for the West to have colonies in the East and stuff like that. So that's kind of takes like the real world consequences. So yeah, I think the Said essay highlights a lot of stuff about these categories that I think the play is so interested in, and hopefully helps us think about what's going on with Gallimard and stuff. All right, I think that's all I'll say about it. I'll see you later.